Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's tremendous to be here. I always enjoy my visits here. And I'm always very happy to see growth and expansion, bit by bit, but steadily. And this is a sign of Allah's blessing on this community. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Alhamdulillah, excuse me, talking sitting, but I just prefer that, and it reminds me of a saying of Sidi Ali Jamal, who is a great wali of Allah, who's buried in the depths of Fes in Morocco, and he was very unknown, but he had tremendous knowledge. And someone said once, tell me about Sidi Ali Jamal, and the man who was asked said, what can you say about a man who has to beg for his food every day, but he knows when the whales in the depths of the ocean are hungry? And this indicates that this incredible connection that he had with Allah's creation, even though he lived miles away from the sea. And at the same time, one's reminded of the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, when a person of knowledge dies, then the whales in the depths of the ocean weep. And again, there's this connection between the awliya, between the friends of Allah, and these vast creatures who we hardly ever see. Maybe sometimes if we're in a ship and we see them surface momentarily, maybe we'll see films of this. But most of the time they're hidden. Maybe sometimes we see pictures of them when they've been caught and they're being carved up. But they are part of the world, that Richard Attenborough has, brought to our attention, which was only possible really in these last 50 years or so. And it indicates a relationship between the Khalif of Allah on the earth, the Khulafa of Allah on the earth, and the earth itself. Now, what I wanted to look at this afternoon was just really the relationship, if you like, between Allah and His creation. Because certainly there are many different views, and even when people are talking about climate change and the effect that it's having on the earth and the environment, there are different viewpoints that are inherent in the way that it's spoken about. And I remember when I was a small child, I was very lucky because I was born in the middle of Africa, in the middle of nowhere, really, in the middle of the bush. And I had a very free childhood, and I was exposed really from day one to this incredible creation of savanna land and creatures and birds and the movement of the moon and the sun and the planets. It was a big event. If you saw one plane in the whole year, it was like everyone would run out to look at this thing flying through the air. That's how rare it was. We wish it would be so nice, if that plane wasn't flying overhead every 10 minutes. But then it was a big event. And because my parents were not churchgoers, I had very much a free rein in figuring out what exactly the world was that I found myself in. And most of us, in some way or another, find ourselves kind of parachuted in to existence, and we spend our life finding out about it. And sometimes we have the good fortune to have knowledgeable parents or knowledgeable teachers who can teach us a lot without us even having to think about it. But often we're like the man on the island that Dr. Lutfi Radwan was talking about, that we look around us and we try and work things out. And I remember that from a very young age, there were two things I loved doing. One was chopping down trees, and the other was building bonfires. My mother used to ration me to 2 matches a day, and I remember once I got the fire going. At last I got a fire going, and I was so excited I chopped down half the chicken coop, because we used to keep our own chickens, we kept our own sheep, grew our own vegetables. But I was so excited. Of course I got into trouble, but it was worth it. But when I reflect on it later, I think, subhanAllah, isn't this what they're doing on a much bigger scale? This was just a kid playing about, and the tree that I chopped down would be used as firewood eventually. And the fires that I made were not mega, they weren't big bushfires or anything like that. But isn't this what's happening to the environment on a big scale? In a way that the Amazon forest is being decimated, and whole football patches, the size of a whole football pitch, is like being cleared every second, I think, something like that. It's an incredible rate of deforestation of the lungs of the world. And I think this is one thing that has come out in everything that everybody said, all the different speakers coming at it from different angles, because there's so much to consider and to reflect on. But planting trees is so important, and this is something that I've done, certainly in my more mature years. Instead of chopping them down, I've been planting them. Wherever I go, I plant a tree. And usually I plant a fruit tree. And sometimes I'm lucky enough to live long enough to be able to eat the fruit of the tree that I planted, but if not, it's for someone else. But this is something that we can do on a much larger scale. Here at Hijaz, you can plant a mini forest. You can keep bees. You can keep sheep. You can keep chickens as part of your community, so that part of your sustenance is actually the produce of your own hands. And this is something that is a long tradition in England. You often find communities that are self-surviving, really. They have at their hands, by the work of their hands, much of the food they need is produced by them or looked after by them. And this is something really that in terms when Professor Pierce said, what shall I tell the government? I think one of the things you can, and you underlined it yourself, tell them to encourage everyone to plant trees and to look after their own, food supply, to grow their own vegetables, to have sheep where they can, if their country, to have chickens, to have bees. This will transform life. And this is something, one of my grandfathers used to do all of this in England. He used to keep bees. And it's something I've always wanted to do, but I haven't been able to do it up to now, but inshallah I will. But this is something that we can all do. But coming back to the main point that I made, was what I really wanted to look at was, what is the relationship between Allah and His creation? Because certainly as I was growing up, I did go to a church school which was Christian, and the kind of picture that I got, which was a very common picture as it turned out, was that God created the earth and then left man to get on with it. And really he wasn't very much involved with day-to-day life, but every so often he would step in. So he created the flood, when the people of Noah were disobedient. And we can take examples like that from the Prophet's Sirah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that in the Battle of Badr, when he picked up the sand and threw it in the enemy's faces, Allah says it wasn't you who threw when you threw, but it was Allah who threw. And the Mufassirun say that a speck of dust went into every eye of the Kafirun so that they were blinded. And this was part of the reason why they were so heavily defeated, even though they heavily outnumbered the Muslims. Even with the story of Ibrahim that we've had referred to several times, not only was the bird, doing its bit, but also Allah said, Ya naru kuni baradan wa salama, O fire, be coolness and peace to Ibrahim. So it lost its ability to burn him, and for him it was like a cool breeze. So no wonder it didn't burn him, even though, by all accounts, it was a huge fire. It was like a whole valley was filled with this fire, and he was in the middle of it, but it didn't touch him. So we have these kind of examples of, as it were, Allah intervening in the lives of the prophets. But otherwise, the view that I got of existence was that Allah left us to get on with it. And therefore, I think, as Max pointed out, he said that if you're not careful, the response, and also Dr. Lutfi, you feel this overwhelming weight of responsibility because it's all up to me, which is not the case, in fact. And then even more extreme from that is the people who don't believe in God at all. They think that everything happened by chance, and there's this big bang and no one goes into what caused it. And then out of this primeval slime came these first organisms, and from it, gradually the animals, etc., and then finally the apes, and then somehow man. And they've never found the missing link, but it doesn't seem to trouble people too much. And if they don't go into the whole science of linguistics, and how could that possibly develop from ape grunts, because there's no connection. They leave all of that on one side, but underpinning it is this philosophy that we're always evolving and getting better, and especially getting better at making money. And most of what drives people is making money. So what is underneath the deforestation of the Amazon is the desire for wealth. And what finances it is a usurious system, which every revelation from God to man has forbidden, because it's so damaging, because it is based on exploitation, it's based on getting something for nothing. And it is like a cancer, it devours the host organism until the host organism itself dies. And this really, if you look at what is fueling climate change, it is usury, it's institutionalized usury. But no one looks at this, or it never gets the headlines. And I think this is another thing to tell the government. If you're really serious about bringing about big change, get rid of institutionalized usury, make it illegal to charge interest, and start with yourself. Start investing, stop investing money to get more money out of nothing by charging interest. It's a big thing. It goes right to the kind of the hidden foundations of so-called modern culture. But this is what is so rotten in this state of Denmark, if I can borrow the phrase from Hamlet, only it's not Denmark, it's the whole world. And this is something that has to be addressed. And again, from the stories of, especially from Sidna Isa, what did he do? He threw out the moneylenders from the Temple of Suleiman, because it had become a place of worship of wealth rather than the worship of the wealthy, who is Allah. And there's no one wealthier than Allah, because Allah has created everything. He is al-Halak al-Bari al-Musawwir. He is the one who has an idea and forms it and says kun fayakun, and then it becomes a reality. So the source form in the malakut, in the unseen, manifests as a form in the mulk, in this physical world that we see. So that the whole creational process is a divine event. Now, also what is most important is that Allah is not separate from the creation. You can't identify him with the creation. You can't confine him in any form or any concept even. But at the same time, what keeps it alive is Allah's command. And we know from not only the descriptions in the Quran, where Allah says, that everything in the heavens and the earth praises Allah, including the stones and the trees, but we know that for the people who are wide awake, they hear it. So the Prophet ﷺ used to hear them doing dhikr of Allah, and they used to greet him and say, Salaam alaikum, Ya Rasulullah. Says he walked down the path. He wasn't kicking dead stones. He wasn't leaning against a tree that had some life in it, but no awareness. And as we know, he said, all the creatures have their prophets. All the creatures have their communities. So the whole creation is alive. And this is something amazing. And then we see, what is the connection? Dr. Lutfi talked about free will. Because when you look at the part of our iman, our pillars of iman, we believe that everything is by the decree of Allah. Nothing is outside the control of Allah. Everything is by the decree, the good of it and the bad of it. That means climate change, from one perspective, by the haqiqah, is by the decree of Allah. It's not that like some kind of entity entered the equation and started messing about with it. This is by the decree of Allah. And then you say, well, if that's the case, then what can we do? And you may think of that ayah of which describes Sidna Ibrahim, when he breaks the idols that his father had carved, and they said, what do you think you're doing? And he said, well, ask them. And they said, well, don't be stupid, they can't talk. And he said, well, why do you worship what you carve rather than the one who created you and what you do? And what you do. So we have this irrefutable statement from Allah that He has put on the earth the people who do these things. The people who do stupid things, like worshipping idols, and then the people who have wisdom and who put things right. And this is one of the descriptions Dr. Lutfi referred to fasad, and the ayats that refers to the fasad that is spread through the earth. And in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, the mufsidun are described, the people who create fasad, who create corruption, are described as the people who say, we're only putting things right. Where have we heard this statement from so many politicians through the years? We're only putting things right, vote for me, everything will be fine. And we go from one disaster to another because they don't know what they're doing. And even if they have the best of intentions, they don't have the best of knowledge to actually put things right. And if you look at what is in the Quran, it's extraordinary because it describes the creational process. Even how the fetus is formed in the womb. Very accurate picture revealed to someone who couldn't read or write for more than 14 centuries ago. But who would know except Allah how that happens? And it's there in the Quran. And then we have these descriptions of the creation of the heavens and the earth. And as Max said, it's sorry, it was astaghfirullah, the speaker before you, but I've forgotten his name. Jamal. As Jamal said, a day with Allah is thousands and thousands and thousands of our years. So it's a whole different time span. But we have descriptions of the creation, and then how Allah has ordered the earth, and how He's ordered the heavens, and how He's ordered the seas, and this incredible picture of really everything at the service of man, if he only knows how to look after it. Because it's not that a Khalif is someone who tells everyone what to do and does as he pleases in the creation. It's the one who stands in for the one who's in charge, and he is responsible for looking after the creation in the best way. And this is really key to understanding that although Allah is the creator of us and what we do, we are answerable for our actions. And it's illustrated in that story of the Prophet ﷺ, when one of the Sahabas came rushing in because he didn't want to miss whatever was going on in the gathering. And the Prophet ﷺ said, what have you done with your camel? And he said, well, it's outside, Allah will look after it. At least I'm here. And he said, go and tie up your camel. Trust in Allah, but tie up your camel. And this really, in terms of what we can do, we have to trust in Allah, but we have to tie up our camel. But then how do we trust in Allah? Because it's not a blind faith. It's not say, well, Allah, I'm trusting in you and I'll carry on my own sweet way. The key is following the Prophet ﷺ. And in the Quran there's an ayah, I was looking for it and I couldn't find it last night, but it's a very clear ayah. It says, those who do not follow prophetic guidance are self-destroyed. They destroy themselves. It's a very clear ayah. And there are many examples of this. Allah says, when we want to destroy a people, we give the people in charge excess wealth and they misuse it and they destroy themselves. There are all these illustrations of how people have done that. And with the people of Lot, it's through sexual excess in the wrong direction. With others, it's just building up wealth and power and magic, as with Pharaoh. But again and again, we get the same pattern, that when a messenger is sent to people, some people accept and follow, and some people reject and don't follow. And the people who reject and don't follow make trouble for the people who accept and follow, but in the end they lose out. And this is the sunnah of Allah. And you see, sunnah, literally it means a form. So for us, mainly we talk about the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And this was his way of doing things. And when Sayyidat Aisha was asked, what was the Prophet like? She said he was like the Quran walking, meaning, he embodied what he taught. There wasn't a difference between his words and what he did. So, and several times Allah says in the Quran, there is no changing the sunnah of Allah. There's no changing the sunnah of Allah. It can't be altered. And the sunnah of Allah is that the people who reject the prophetic guidance in the end are self-destroyed. By their own actions, they are self-destroyed because they inevitably take a pattern of action which is not productive. And this is what we see manifested in the world today very clearly. And we also see that when people are called to follow the deen, there is confusion because often people actually who are calling them don't have the original Islam that the prophets brought and communicated. So people say, I'm not going to follow that. Thank you very much. You think I'm going to follow ISIS? ISIS has got nothing to do with Islam, really. They are like the modern Khawarij, and the Prophet talked about them. They came in the time of Sayyidina Ali, and they've come regularly throughout the last 14 centuries, and they are these so-called Muslims who put themselves above all the other Muslims and then have a very narrow view of existence and then go even further and say, if you're not one of us, then we can kill you. And so then they commit all sorts of terrible wrong actions. And the Prophet ﷺ said these people are like an arrow that goes through game. The time that they were Muslim was like the time when the arrow was in the flesh before it passed out of the flesh. But basically they're not Muslim, they're out of the deen. And so one has to be, and unfortunately it's the kind of tabloid press that gives them prominence and their spokespeople, and hardly ever talks about the awliya or the Muslims who follow a middle way, or the Muslims who look after each other, who are like two hands washing each other, like the posts of the roof that support each other. They never get the headlines, unfortunately. But in fact, again, if the government is really serious, they should actually call people to embrace Islam. Because if people follow the Prophet ﷺ, they will be safe, they will be sound. There's that beautiful ayah where Allah says, whoever obeys Allah and His Prophet will be with, and then who will they be with? They will be with the awliya, they will be with the sadiqeen, the sincere, they will be with the shuhada, the witnesses. And sometimes this is translated as martyrs, but also it means the people who see, the people who understand. And with the salihin, the people who are in the right place at the right time. And this is not talking only about the akhirah, the next world after we've left this world, but it's talking about now. And then if you look at the people who guard this knowledge, it is the awliya of Allah, it is the friends of Allah. And Sheikh Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, may Allah be pleased with him, he said the awliya are like the ruh, they're like the spirit of the earth. And when there are no longer any awliya in the earth, that will be the qiyamah, that will be the end of it, that will be the end of the world, because it will not be possible for the world to continue without that ruhani presence. And so this is after the return of Jesus. This is after the return of peaceful rule under Jesus, who, one of his miracles, he knew the Torah by heart, he knew the Injil by heart, and he'll know the Quran by heart, and he'll lead the Muslims in prayer and follow the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So, at that point, this is why the jizya will be abolished, because then it will be very clear what the truth is and what falsehood is. There won't be any time for debate. There won't be any time for, making these differences that appear plausible at the moment. Things will be very clear at that time. But beyond that will be a time when Allah sends a wind that takes all the arwah of the mu'minun, and then the people who are left will live like animals. And this is when it will be very near the end of the world. Now, these descriptions of what will happen towards the end of time, and also the descriptions that we have, and obviously there's no time to go into them now, but all the signs of the end, the ayam al-fitan, the days of trial, which we find ourselves in today, all the signs are described. And so many of them we see in front of our eyes very clearly. But it indicates also that there is an ajal, there is a time frame for creation, which Allah has already destined for the world. So it's not like, I remember when I was growing up, there was always this fear that with the Cold War going on, that there's going to be this huge big atomic fight and the whole world will be destroyed. And this was based on a fear which was based on ignorance, because in fact we know that other things are going to happen before the world ends, and none of the descriptions in the hadith, in the Quran, talk about an atomic shootout. And in the same way, when we look at climate change, this is one of the signs of the end of time. The Prophet said, towards the end of time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, animals would become extinct, insects would become extinct. And we're seeing this happen at this incredible increasing rate. And you sometimes think, well, what can I do to stop it? Many of the speakers today have said, what can I do to stop this thing happening that I don't want and a lot of ordinary people don't want? We don't want to live in this world that is becoming more and more mundane and more plastic and more polluted and more destroyed. What do we do to stop it? And sometimes we feel helpless. We feel like a bit of plankton that's being swept in a current with millions of other bits of plankton by an ocean current. And what free will does a bit of plankton have in that ocean current? Very little. Maybe it can have a chat with the plankton next to it, have a bite of this or that. But if you look at the whole current of events of that wave of plankton, it's already decided. That whatever makes that current happen, and for the mu'minun we say it's Allah who makes it happen in the end. You can say it's because of this climate and this temperature and this change of water temperature and this the pull of the gravity and blah blah blah. But in the end, it's Allah who makes it happen by these means. And you say, what can I do? But I think, as Dr. Lutfi said, he quoted that hadith that if you were in the middle of planting a seed when the Qiyamah comes, complete planting it, even though it will never have time to grow, because at the Qiyamah everything comes to an end, and everyone who's ever lived will be brought back to life, and everyone will be judged, and everyone will end up in the fire or the garden. These are things we know are coming when the whole of existence, the whole of the universe is rolled up. And from what little we know, from what we observe in telescopes, at the moment, the universe is still expanding. From that first kun fayakun, that first big bang, if you like, where everything was set in motion. And part of that being set in motion was the creation of the heavens and the earth in these 6 days, which are, billions of years old. But at a certain point, after that expansion, there will be a contraction. And so, Allah talks about the heavens being rolled up, and the mountains, which are described as the pegs, which keep the earth stable, becoming like dust, becoming like carded wool in the wind, becoming just atoms. And this is, it's frightening when you think about it, but it's something that will happen, whether it's in our lifetimes or not, but it will happen. And this is far beyond any kind of climate change, and it's far beyond any kind of major events, as Alex was describing, where suddenly these cataclysmic events would happen, and like 70% of the world's species would be wiped out, and there'd be a big kind of carbon dioxide festival for the next however many million years. But that is nothing compared to the end of things, which will come. And I remember my teacher once saying that he said that the people have some understanding of this, and sometimes it's so overwhelming you can't really understand it. But he said they have the look of shock on their faces, and you often see that in the face of the Muslim. There is a face of someone who's been overwhelmed by a recognition of this incredible power that Allah has over His creation. And you see, this was something that Sidna Musa asked. He said, Allah, I want to see you. You know, it was out of love for Allah. He said, Allah, I want to see you. And Allah said to him, you won't be able to take it. He said, I will manifest an atom of my might to that mountain. Look at that mountain and see what happens. And the mountain was just reduced to dust. And Sayyidina Musa lost consciousness. And when he came round, you know, he said the Shahada, and he said, Astaghfirullah, you know, excuse me for asking, because then he realized how mighty the might of Allah is. And this is something that's, in a way, we spend our whole lifetime finding out. The rububiyyah, the lordship that Allah has over His creation, which is completely absolute. But at the same time, we can be like the Sahaba who was told to tie up his camel, and we can be like the person who's planting the seed before the end of the world comes. And I think the key to it is do it on a small scale. You know, even if you live by yourself in a suburb somewhere, plant something in your garden. You know, keep chickens. I have a neighbor who keeps chickens. You know, we're in a council block of flats, but he's got chickens in his garden. You know, and they wake everyone up. But it's a lovely sound. You know, it reminds me of my childhood. And then if you go to Willowbrook Farm, you know, visit Dr. Lutfi, because what he's done is extraordinary. I remember when he and Ruby first moved in there with their children, you know, it was basically a caravan at the end of the field. And I thought, what on earth are they doing? And then over the years, it's extraordinary how they've developed the farm, you know, put up buildings, built this cob house, you know, planted trees, you know, introduced more and more livestock, invited people to come and learn, you know, using alternative methods of generating energy, you know, recycling everything. It's extraordinary what they've done, and they are like a community. You know, they started as a family, but now they're a community, and their children have grown up and married and are having their children, and you know, the whole thing is expanding, and you can learn so much from it in terms of seeing what is possible. And already, again, what the Muslims can do, and I think this is something that all the government can recommend to everyone, not just to the Muslim, but you know, we have this thing of have a plastic-free iftar during Ramadan. You know, use real plates, use real cups, even if it means washing them up. But don't have this kind of throwaway mentality. Maybe just have plastic rubbish bags to put what rubbish there is. But it's amazing how much less there is. And this is something that people can be encouraged right across the country. Stop using plastic. It's awful. You know, I've never liked it. I've always hated it. In fact, it was more or less invented the same year I was born, which is a long time back now, and I won't give you the exact year. But as I've grown up, the kind of presence of plastic has become more invasive in my life as well, and I've never liked it. I mean, sometimes I use it, but I've never liked it. I hate plastic forks and plastic spoons and plastic plates and plastic cups, and so often you don't need them. You don't need them. You can have proper cutlery. You can have proper plates. You know, some people can even make their own pottery, which is a delight. And it's a whole science. So these skills that were part of everyday life need to be kept alive in England. And perhaps I'll just close by saying, you know, look at what the Victorians did. Because in the Victorian era, you know, the big cities were like cesspools. You know, they didn't have a proper system for getting rid of all their waste, and they stunk to high heaven. You know, to the extent that in the Houses of Parliament, they had to kind of perfume the curtains. There's been a very interesting program in television lately about it, which is why it comes to mind. But also they built these wonderful water reservoirs, you know, in the high ground, in the Lake District, and in the Dales, and then they moved the water just by gravity, you know, a long way, for example, to Liverpool and to other cities surrounding the area. So with a bit of ingenuity, they completely changed the quality of people's lives. And if they could do that with sewerage and fresh water, then think what we can do in terms of generating alternative means of energy. And just as Professor Piers has said, you know, if we plant more trees, we get rid of the carbon dioxide in a very natural way. as well as providing a habitat for all these birds and insects that need it anyway, and having a pleasant place for us to walk in. And England used to be covered in trees. There's no reason why it can't be covered in trees again, and this applies to a lot of Europe. A lot of the high-tech north can actually rediscover that. And it is actually one of the signs of the end of the world that the deserts will be made green, and already there are these kind of very ambitious projects to make the deserts green, to have the water supply that will feed the plants so they can grow. And it will be wonderful to see, although in one way you'll say, well, that's one more sign. There's so many now. But I think the thing is that I remember when I first accepted Islam, the first bit of advice I got, almost the first, was, the first bit of advice was don't expect anything from anyone, but which has been very useful. But one of the first bits of advice I got was, live in this world as if you're going to live forever, and prepare for the next world as if you're going to die tomorrow. And that's very good advice. It's very good advice, because as the Prophet said when he was with some of his Sahaba, he said, in 100 years, none of us will be on the face of the earth. And it's the same for all of us sitting here this afternoon. In 100 years, none of us will be here. We will be underground. So get ready for it, because when you die, that's not the end of it. You don't become dust. There's a whole new chapter. The life in this world is so short. And we had a whole time in the world of the spirits before we came into this world. And when we leave this world, we're back in the world of the spirits, and we're in the barzakh, within the interspace between this world and the last day. And then beyond that is the akhirah with the fire in the garden, no third option. And we have to be ready for that. We have to be ready for that. And it's like, all of us, for us, those of us who don't live here, we made preparations to get here. Say, yeah, well, I need to make sure there's petrol in the car. Shouldn't be burning it up, but I'll have to just to get here. And then, yeah, I'll need to leave at this time to get here by this time. We make preparations. So in the same way, you have to prepare for the akhirah, because that's forever. And Allah says in the Quran, people will be asked in the akhirah, how long were you on the earth for? And we'll say, oh, it was like a day or a bit of a day. Very short. It's like the old Anglo-Saxon metaphor of the bird that flies into the long Anglo-Saxon feasting hall and flies the length of the building and then flies out the window at the other end. And that time in the hall, that's how long your life is on this earth. Very short. And we look at the life of the fruit fly and we say, poor thing, it only lives a day. But for the fruit fly, that's a whole lifetime. That's like 90 years for us. And so everything is relative, but it's very short. And the Prophet ﷺ said, the moment is sharp. Either you cut with it or it cuts you. And we're very much in that situation now. And I think, I appreciate very much what Professor Pierce said, because he really put his finger on a lot of important issues, and Max as well, issues that need to be dealt with, that are within our grasp, of actually making a change and making a positive difference. So we can transform the British Isles today and provide an example for the rest of the world that the Victorians provided in their time. And they didn't mess around. They were very, very good at what they did. Look at all the bricks they baked and used. So we ask Allah that you bless the British Isles, and that you make it a green and pleasant land as it always has been. But may we regain what we've lost. Allah, may we learn from what is happening at the hands of the people who don't fear you and who don't follow your messenger. And Allah, may we not only learn from their mistakes, but also follow the good example of the Prophet ﷺ and follow in the dust of his footsteps as best we can. Allah, we ask that you open the hearts of England to Islam, and the Islam that the Prophet brought, the Islam of which he said, the Muslim is the one from whose tongue and whose hand you are safe. Allah, let us have that kind of a land and that kind of government. And Allah, may we be free of people who don't know what they're doing. And may we be free of people who don't care what they're doing because they're just interested in making money. Allah, give us people to rule the land who value life and who value country and who want to leave something good for their children and grandchildren and generations to come as long as the world lasts. And Allah, we ask that you change people's hearts so that you don't have to destroy whole peoples as you have in the past when they refused to follow the messengers that you'd sent. And Allah, we ask especially that you bless this community. Allah, may it expand. Allah, bless its men and women and its children. Allah, may they all be people of knowledge. May they be people who have balanced lives. May they be people who are pleasing to you and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And may they be an example for everyone who visits them and everyone who hears of them. And we ask that you bless Sheikh Muhammad Abdul Wahab Siddiqui in his grave. And we ask that it is wide and full of light and full of perfume, and that he sees his place in the garden in the morning and the evening, and that whoever visits him and greets him, that their du'as are answered by you, because the du'as are made to you, not to him. But that we ask that the du'as that people make for him are answered. And by his barakah, we ask that this is a protected place, and a place that is safe from the mufsidun, and a place that benefits from the awliya and the salihin and the mu'minun. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. As-sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim. غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد عبدك ورسولك نبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. Thank you.